Welcome back. Your tummies should all be full now, right? Ready to just rest and listen? So thank you for joining us for our third and final session, which is kind of sad, though. I'm sad about that, too. Friday night, I think it was, I mentioned doing redos. That I'd have to ask sometimes for a redo. Can I have a redo on that? Can anybody relate? Am I the only one who's had to do that? Oh, good. I don't feel quite so alone. So the person who comes to mind in the Bible for this afternoon's topic is Paul. Didn't Paul have to do a major redo? I mean, he had all this training, and then he had to, no, I'm going to retrain you. This is not what I want you to do. God had to retrain him. He had to do a major redo. So this afternoon, we're doing relational EQ. Think twice, act once. I want to learn to do that.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. All right. Well, today we are going to be continuing on this topic of healing. Really healing the brain is kind of the background for this. And so even though trauma has been a little bit of the focus, it probably would have been useful if I told you a little bit ahead of time what the word trauma means. Now, has anybody ever looked up the word trauma to find out what it means? All right. So the word trauma, I believe it's the Latin translation of the word wound. So if you were reading, like, a famous text like what it says in Isaiah 53, where it talks about he was wounded for our transgressions, you would translate that with the Latin word, it would be he was traumatized for our transgressions. It's just something to contemplate and consider for a minute. And it's actually by his stripes, which are his wounds, we are healed. Similar to that children's story, all those gray dots, he takes them away. All those failings and scars and injuries. In fact, when we get to heaven, the only traumas that will be left won't be on us. So just consider that for a moment. So earlier today, we were talking about breaking generational trauma, and someone reminded me of a part of the text that I wanted to include. Part of the reason why we use that scripture from Exodus chapter 20 is because at the end of it, it's not just that the sins are visited unto the third and fourth generation, but it says that he shows mercy unto thousands that love him and keep his commandments. Now that word there, thousands, is not thousands of people. It's in contrast to the third and fourth generation. So while sin may go for 3 or 4 generations, his mercy goes for thousands of generations. His mercy outlasts our sins. And somebody please say amen to that. We can count on God's mercy. It is everlasting. God is a loving and merciful God, and whatever it is that we've inherited, those things can be overcome because he has a mercy that outlasts our sins, and we can all be very grateful for that. Well, today we're going to be looking at emotion regulation. This is a topic that is actually really important. I can't think of a single situation where emotion regulation does not serve people well. I remember as Dr. Neil Nedley, he had given a lecture a long time ago, and I remember I was listening to it. He was talking about you can have too much of a lot of things. Like it's possible, even though water is good, to have too much water. You can actually experience toxic amounts of water that can actually kill you. Unfortunately, they found this out from water drinking competitions, that there is such a thing as too much water. You can have too much cake. That's probably not hard to imagine, is it? And you can have too much like junk food, but you can also have too many healthy things. There was a woman who was trying to lose a lot of weight, and she was told by a doctor that she can have oranges, and then she gained weight. And he asked her how many oranges was she eating. She ate like 26 of them. And it's like, well, yes, if you eat 26 oranges, you're probably not going to lose weight doing that because eventually that amount of sugar will catch up with you. But there is one thing you cannot have too much of. And the thing you can't have too much of is actually self-control. Now, you might immediately think, oh, wait a minute, what about people with OCD? They clean, they wash their hands, they seem to be very controlled. But it's the exact opposite. They're overdoing it. They're trying to compensate for something by everything has to be extra clean. And they wash their hands so much that their hands start to bleed and crack, which actually makes them more prone to infection. But when it comes down to self-control, it's actually impossible to have too much of it. And so what we're going to be looking at here is emotion regulation in the big picture, and this idea that if we can think twice, we can just act once. And it's a really powerful thing to be able just to stop and think. In fact, very many of our decisions that we've made, if we just would have given ourselves about 10 more seconds to think that through just a little bit further, we probably would have made a better choice. And I'm sure everybody here can relate to this. So we're going to be looking at how to identify strategies of emotion regulation. We're going to look at how to understand something that's called internal working models. I won't get too much in the technical on that. And this idea of how to reflect, remap, and relearn through changing these models in our mind of how we see the world. And there's another piece in here where I'll talk a little bit about communication skills. But before we did that, I wanted everybody to be able to have a deep sigh of relief that we no longer try to deal with emotions the way that they used to. So in that picture there, you can see how psychology has changed through time. As you see there in the quote, it says, through the ages, psychologically distorted people have received brutal treatments, including trephination, which is evident from the Stone Age. This was like a skull that was found from some of these old fossil finds. And as you can see, those holes are not natural. And you can tell because they are very circular shaped. And trephination is actually was the practice of drilling circular holes into people's skulls to let the demons out. And you can imagine whether or not this person actually survived the cure. I'll leave it to your guessing, but they did not have anesthesia during the time where this skull was discovered. And while I don't believe in some of these long ages, certainly this was far before our time. But trephination used to be the way people would do this. People were so concerned about how to deal with these emotions, which can feel so out of control, that these are some of the things that they resorted to. So you can thank the Lord, and you can be glad for advancements that if you go see a therapist, they will not be drilling holes in your skull to try to help you with like your depression, anxiety. We found a better way, and we can all be thankful for that. So how do we deal with emotions? Now, emotions are very powerful. All emotions actually serve a purpose. You don't just feel the way that you do by accident. So you remember we were talking a little bit about the mice earlier today and how they felt afraid of the smell. Now that can sound like that's a disadvantage, but it's actually a benefit to already know things that your parents learned from, right? Like if you can learn from your parents or from your ancestors' mistakes, you can save yourself a lot of time. And so one of the reasons this gets handed down is so that when these mice are born, they actually know already what they should be fearful of. Now, fear is not a really comfortable emotion, but it can save your life. I don't know if anybody's, how many people have been here to the Grand Canyon? Yes? Okay. All right. Now, how many people have been tempted to try to walk along the edge of the Grand Canyon just because you like really want to look over and then to see if your nerves can handle leaning over the edge? How many people are tempted to do this sometimes? Okay, you can feel that temptation. Now, do you also feel that apprehension? Do you feel your heart rate go up? Feel something that tells you like, hey, be careful here? These are your emotions doing the job they're supposed to do, because one of the primary functions of your emotion is to help keep you alive. Now, emotions can get really challenging sometimes, especially when we're dealing with things like anger. I recall I was working with a parent, and he was there because he seemed very calm, very mild-mannered. He used to be a police officer, and they were fostering children, and he was there because he felt like he was having such difficulty controlling his children. And when his wife had come in, well, she explained, it's like, well, you know, I think some of the challenge is that, you know, when David loses his temper, not me, the gentleman I was talking to, when David loses his temper, you know, it can kind of get a little bit out of control. And I was like, well, how bad are we talking here? And apparently, whenever he would get upset, the yelling would be so loud that neighbors like 4 or 5 houses down would call the police because they thought something was going on. Now, he never actually physically hurt his children, but when anger took over, it would take over in such a major way that he could just barely, like he could not control himself. Now, when you actually get angry, several things are happening in your body. First of all, you're going to experience like a surge of adrenaline, because that anger is there to help you to fight or to protect yourself from danger. The second thing that you're going to experience, believe it or not, and this is why anger can get addictive, is you're going to get a hit of dopamine. Now, how many people are familiar with dopamine? You've heard about dopamine before? Okay, so dopamine is like that feel-good chemical in your brain. You have a little part of your brain, it's called nucleus accumbens. It's a small little pea-sized shaped portion of the brain, and what it does is it dumps out this pleasurable hormone to reward you whenever you do something good or you pursue something good. And for a long time, they thought that dopamine, its primary purpose was just to make you feel good, but it actually has a second purpose. And the way they found this out is that they took rats, and in those rats what they did is they knocked out the gene that would allow it to produce dopamine, and if you put food in front of that rat, it would eat it. But if you put that food more than one body length in front of it, it would starve to death. And that was really bizarre. And what had actually happened is that without dopamine, there isn't anything that tells you to go and get something. Now, what they did after this is they looked at experiments about when your dopamine is the highest. And your dopamine is the highest not when you actually do something, but when you're about to do something. All right? Anybody been on a roller coaster before? All right, what's the most exciting part of the roller coaster?
All of it.
Right, all of it. Yeah. So usually where your excitement is going to hit its peak is when you're right at the top, about to go down. Now the sinking part and the going downhill and all that stuff is pretty fun, but your adrenaline and your dopamine is at its peak when you're at the top. And this is how dopamine actually works. It's the thing that helps you, it rewards you for getting up to the top. And when they knock this out of the mice, if that pellet that they were supposed to eat was more than one of its own body lengths away from them, they would just give up and they would literally die before they ever ate anything. Now, as a third little side note here, and I'm still talking about anger, I'll get back to that in a moment. Dopamine is something that actually drops really low when people are depressed, right? So if you've ever experienced depression or know somebody who is depressed, one of the reasons it's so hard to like get in the shower or go eat is because that thing is more than a body length away in terms of how far they have to reach. And in fact, if you work with somebody who's depressed, if you put something right in front of their face, a lot of times they can take care of it, they can do it. But once that thing gets removed just a little too far, they don't have the chemical balance that allows them to go after it. Does it make sense to everybody so far? Now I'm going to tie this back to anger, and you're going to see why anger actually is not in and of itself a bad emotion. When people get angry, they actually get big hits of dopamine. And it's part of what motivates them, unfortunately, want to go punch somebody in the face, but it motivates them to want to do something. So when I'm working with people who are depressed, guess which emotion, there's a couple of them that I go after, but guess which is one of my top 3 emotions I go to when I'm dealing with somebody who's depressed? I go with anger. And the other reason I do that is because a lot of times people who are depressed are actually angry about something. I've never met anybody who's depressed who wasn't mad about something. Now, a lot of times what happens is that anger gets turned back in on themselves. My previous supervisor said that aggression is when anger gets turned outward. Depression is when anger gets turned inward. And sarcasm is when anger gets turned sideways. And I like that. It's stuck in my head, but it's something that you can absolutely observe. When people are depressed, the anger turns inward. They start to hate themselves. They feel like the world would be better off without them. The aggressive emotions are there, but it's self-destructive, right? And when people are on the more explosive side, all the aggression is outward. Like, this is everyone else's fault. Everyone has, messed me up and all these other pieces. Now, both of those can be destructive. But when anger is actually turned toward the thing it needs to be, it actually can be an extreme motivator. It could be an intense motivator. And we have a saying in our household that we talk to our children. Whenever there's an issue going on between them or them with us, we always tell them we want to fight the problem, not the person, right? You fight the problem, not the person. And so this is one of the ways in which an emotion like anger, which does charge us up to try to fight, can be used productively. If I take that energy and I fight the problem, now I can use that aggression to motivate me towards doing something that is productive. All right, does that make sense to everyone so far? So all emotions serve a purpose. I'll just throw out 2 more emotions here. One of the other ones that sometimes people don't feel very comfortable with is emotion of sadness. Most people don't enjoy feeling sad. But sadness is an emotion that we actually need. Now, the example I always give to people, because if you actually pay attention to what emotions are trying to do, you can actually start using your emotions rather than trying to avoid them. So when people feel sadness, like let's say there was like a memorial service, everybody comes together, which people instinctively do this. So one of the functions of sadness, incidentally, is actually to bring people together. The other thing that people do when they feel sadness naturally, and I use a memorial service as a good example of this, is they start to share. They share the things that they appreciate. They share ideas and memories and thoughts of the person that matters to them, which incidentally, when you are feeling sad, I'm literally telling you right now what the steps are to resolving it, because you don't need to get rid of your emotions. A lot of times you need to make use of them. So the first step with sadness is it's an emotion that tries to bring us together. It seeks for connection. Sadness is soothed by connection. The second thing it does is it's something that's soothed by expressing. Because as we express and we give ourselves opportunities to speak what we know, then we can actually start to connect with people on an emotional level. As I share with you how much my friend Tom meant to me and how he was this magician mechanic, which he actually was, a really good friend of mine who died way too early, when I share with people the stories about him, like how he fixed one of my cars, and he told me that when he worked on the car, he's like, if I didn't believe in God before, I definitely believe in God after working on your car. He said that car was just barely holding on by bolts and threads. He's like, I don't know how you even got to work in the morning. And I drove this car for hundreds of thousands of miles. I had over 300,000 miles on this car. And he's like, I have no idea how you could possibly be driving this thing. Like, this car was just barely holding on by a thread. And he was just an extremely generous person. And if I had enough time to tell you more about Tom, you would begin to feel a connection with him. But as you begin to feel a connection with him, you also end up making a connection with me, and vice versa. So sadness is an emotion that actually is resolved through our ability to connect. The third emotion that I wanted to share with you all, well, actually, one last note on the sadness one here is you notice that when people get sad, this weird thing starts to happen where there's this accumulation of these strange particles that well up around the corners of people's eyes and sometimes dribble down their cheeks. And some of you may have seen this before. I think we call it crying. Yes, tears. Now, did you know that tears actually serve an extraordinary purpose? Now, when you are just experiencing, everyday tears, like when you cut open an onion and your eyes start to water, there's a reason for this. At any given time, the surface of your eye is covered with a saline solution that actually has in it antimicrobial properties. In fact, 95% of the stuff that would normally infect your eyes or cause eye infections are cleansed away by the natural tears that you have on the surface of your eye. Second thing is that your eyelids serve as like almost windshield wipers. Every time you blink, they just slightly start to clear away just small amounts of like debris and other kinds of particulates that are there. And you can be thankful for that. In fact, one other little cool fact is that your eyelids have a little hinge that catches them, with the exception when you're feeling really sleepy, and actually holds your eyelids open. Have you ever had your eyes actually feel tired from keeping your eyes open for too long? It usually doesn't happen unless you're really, really tired, and that's a whole different experience. But the reason it does that is that when your eyes open up, you have a little hinge that catches them so that they hold in place nice and easily. It'd be nice if they taught us stuff like this, like when we were in school, like in your biology classes. It's incredible design. But aside from all this stuff, part of the reason why your eyes will water whenever you cut open an onion, incidentally, is because onion has sulfur in it. That's why it makes your breath smell so lovely. And so like whenever you cut it open, that sulfur makes contact with your eyes. And do you know what it actually produces? It produces sulfuric acid. And that's why your eyes burn when you cut open an onion. But that burn actually causes your eyes to now wash that stuff out so that you don't end up with sulfuric acid on the surface of your eyes, because as you can probably imagine, your eyes don't like how that feels. And so the primary function of your regular tears is to wash away impurities. Now, you'll never guess what emotional tears are about. You may not know this, but only human beings cry human tears. Your emotional tears are nothing like the tears that just simply wash the impurities off the surface of your eye. They actually contain proteins and hormones and all kinds of things. In fact, 3 of them that I'll tell you about really quickly here, and they're still talking about sadness, is one of them is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is a hormone that's released when you experience an intense stress response. And this is found in high quantities in your tears. A second one that you find in your tears is something called prolactin. And prolactin has a very close relationship with oxytocin. And oxytocin has a very close relationship, with relationships. And in fact, when you have high amounts of oxytocin in your system, it allows you to bond with people. The third thing that you find in there are what's called your endogenous morphines. And it's just like what it sounds like. It's like morphine or like heroin. Now, some of you, hopefully, have never experienced heroin before, but if you know somebody who has, one of the things that they will tell you is that when they take a shot of heroin, it's like getting a warm hug. Now, you have to ask questions. Why on earth would somebody who's abusing drugs want to take a drug that makes it feel like they're receiving a warm hug? I'm just saying. Now, what's so interesting about this is that all of these things are in high quantities in your tears. It's almost like human tears are there to help us feel like we're connected, like we have that warm hug. To help us, that endogenous morphine is also a painkiller. And it's there to help us to be able to start to soothe our pains. And it also flushes out the stress hormones like adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, just in case you think I'm making things up, there are people who have conditions where they are unable to produce tears, and they have higher incidence of ulcers because they can't release their stress through their eyes. And so this idea that you're supposed to suck it up whenever you feel sad and start doing some push-ups, or just keep it to yourself, or pretend like you're happy when you're not, is actually not good advice. it actually is useful to allow your emotions to process through you. Now, you don't want your emotions to control you, but they are there to help. Every single one of these emotions are there to help. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's okay. In the book of Revelation, there's an interesting promise that's made. It says that when we get to heaven, God will wipe away all tears. But do you know why? Because you don't need them. The warm hug will be there. It says that the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. The word there for healing is the word therapia, from which we get our word therapy. When we get to heaven, we will have the most thorough and useful therapy that anyone can possibly imagine. And he will heal and soothe our pains so deeply that they will never return. God knows what he's doing. All of our emotions have a purpose behind them. If we can use them rather than avoid them, then we actually have more control over our emotions. Emotional control is not the same as avoidance and suppression. Emotional control is the same thing as competency. Use your emotions. When you feel sadness, connect with someone. Talk to people. Seek to be understood. This is something that heals. When you feel angry, we don't want to just allow rage to cause us to yell and lose our patience. But just like we taught our children, you don't need to fight people, but use that energy to fight a problem. This make sense so far? So we'll be on the slide for a minute, and that's because you all may not know this, but in the background, all of the presentation stuff I put together before I got here all disappeared. And this happened probably, about 20, 30 minutes before we got started last night. And since then, I've had to scurry and find all my old slides from all these other presentations that I've done in the past and throw them all together and pray that God gives me a good enough memory to be able to share all this stuff with you all. And I know that the reason that this happens is because Satan oftentimes seeks to destroy every plan that you make to do God's will. And so that's a background way of saying pray. But then that's another way of saying, if we're on a slide for a long time, it's not because I'm trying to be annoying. It's because a lot of this stuff we're just having to talk through memory. So you pray for me, and you also pray that God speak directly to you what it is that you need to hear. The third emotion that I want to be able to cover here is the emotion of fear. Now, how many people like feeling afraid? Okay, all right. Oh, you don't mind? Okay, all right. So some people like fear, and you may not realize you like fear until you start going back to the idea of roller coasters and why people watch scary movies and why people do things that just take them right to the edge of their abilities. And then we're like, well, actually, that is kind of fun to go out there and go camping and only bring a knife and nothing else. We do things like this because we want to challenge ourselves. Now, fear is actually a very adaptive emotion. It's something that helps to keep you alive. So I'm going to share with you really quickly a story about Margaret. Now, Margaret, this is actually comes from a book. His name is Gavin DeBecker. He actually wrote a book called The Gift of Fear. It's probably one of the best articulated books on why fear is a protective emotion. And so Margaret left her house one evening, and she was thinking, I don't know if I should go out to go grocery shopping, but she's like, you know what, I can make it back in time, no big deal. So Margaret leaves her house, and as she leaves her house, she goes grocery shopping, she comes back, and she lives in a little bit of one of those gated communities. You have to buzz yourself in, you have to know the code to get in, and then you go into a second set of doors, and then you go into your apartment. So when she gets there, though, she realizes that the gate into the apartment complex that she lives in was unlocked. And she's like, oh, that's weird. The neighbors must have forgot to close it. But something felt uneasy about this. So she goes through there, and she starts to walk up the stairs, and she grabbed all the groceries at once, because you know how we like to do that. We not take 2 trips. And so she has all the groceries at once, and while she's carrying the groceries, she's got the cat food on top, and she turns a corner, and then the fun part happens where the bag rips. Almost made it up the stairs, and then the cat food starts to tumble out of the top of the bag. And so that can of cat food tumbles down, and then, as though it has a mind of its own, it turns the corner and then tumbles down the next set of stairs. Just exactly what you want to happen when you're already feeling frustrated and trying to get home. But then she hears a voice from the bottom of the stairs say, "Got it." And she said immediately when she heard that voice, she didn't like that. She didn't know why she didn't like that, but she didn't like that. And then this guy comes bounding up the stairs, this young, handsome-looking guy comes up the stairs and is like, "Hey, you dropped your cat food. Here, go ahead and take it." He's like, "Hey, let's go ahead and head upstairs. You probably got a hungry cat to feed." And she's like, "Oh, no, I'm fine." It's like, "No, let me help you with your bags. There is such a thing as being too proud, And something told her, don't listen to him, but she's like, felt that social pressure. which a lot of times causes us not to listen to our instincts very well, felt that social pressure to hand him the bag. But as it was narrated in the story, when she handed him the bag, she also handed them a level of control. And so he reiterates as he grabs the bag, he's like, hey, we got a hungry cat to feed. We shouldn't just stand around here all day. It's like, oh, did I ever tell you a story? And then he just keeps talking and talking. It's like, did I ever tell you a story? I had a cat once and then, left the cat there, and I found out a cat can survive for 2 weeks without food, which was a weird comment to make. And as he's talking to her, they get to the front door, and she's like, hey, you know what? I got it from here. I'm fine. Go ahead and hand me the bag, and I'll walk inside. He's like, oh, no way. I'm going to let you go this far, and without helping you all the way. Just what we can do is we can do like how the neighbors do it, how the old ladies do it. Just leave the door open, and I'll walk in there, and I'll set the bag down. I promise. Now, he's saying that I promise because he can tell that she's sensing discomfort, but he's hoping that he can push through with his social cues. Well, long story short, he did not keep his promise, and this ordeal that happened after that lasted for 3.5 hours. And during that time, when he was about to leave, he told her, don't say anything, don't make a noise, I'm going to be right back. And don't worry, you're going to be safe. And she says, okay, I'm listening to you. But then she said for the first time throughout this entire ordeal, she actually felt terror. And something just took over. Something immediately told her as he was walking out, follow him. And so what she did is she followed him about as closely as this mic is strapped to the back of my neck. She was like this close to him. She said if I would have breathed, he would have felt it. But she walked behind him like a ghost and followed him. And as he was going out, he turned toward the kitchen to go grab a knife because, well, he was not a nice person. And as soon as he turned that corner, she bolted towards the front door, opened it, said, I don't know how I knew, but she knew her neighbor's door was open. She bolted into that door, turned around, closed the neighbor's door, told them to be quiet, and stayed and survived. Absolutely incredible. But she said the whole time she felt uncomfortable and nervous and dread and all kinds of other things, but it was right then when real fear struck. And as soon as that happened, she said she listened to her fears and it led her right out of that house. And the cool part is she didn't know why the door was unlocked. She just knew the neighbor's door was unlocked. She said that very distinctly. Now I'm going to share something with you that comes directly from Scripture. When Peter was taken and arrested by Herod at that time, he was going to be killed. And when he was in the prison, and I want you to tell me if you noticed the connections between this story that happened in this woman's life and Peter's story. Now, while he was laying there in prison, he'd already kind of made peace with, okay, I guess I'm just going to die tonight. An angel came and smote him on the side and said, hey, get up. And Peter didn't question. He's like, okay, he gets up. He's like, put on your clothes and put on your shoes. He's like, all right, I'll put on the shoes. The soldiers are asleep. But he just listens to the angel. No questions are asked. He's like, now follow me. And he starts following the angel. And it says they walk past the first gate and the second gate. And he's like, I don't know what's going on. At first, he thought he was in a dream. And then he went to the first gate. It seemed like the gate opened all by itself. And then when he gets there, the angel says, go ahead and walk out. And he walks out. And then he suddenly realizes that was not a dream. Now, what's so profound here is I believe that God speaks to us through our instincts. I do not think that this was just a woman just having her own fears. I believe that the Spirit of God was telling her to get up and move and go now. And our emotions and our instincts are oftentimes channels through which God speaks. This doesn't mean, I'm not talking about go follow your heart. That's not what I'm saying. But when the Spirit of God begins to speak to people, we oftentimes will hear those messages on a visceral, emotional level. And if we have the wherewithal to listen to them, these things can not only help us to function better in life, but can literally save our lives. Now, I bet here there is at least 5 of you that have probably had a story similar to something like this. You were struck with an emotion. Something said, don't talk to that person. Don't follow them. Don't say yes. I remember my dad saw one of his friends who was a young woman that he used to know, and he was driving past her on the freeway, and for whatever reason, he felt like just overwhelmed with terror. Now, my dad's a fairly big guy, and he, in a physical confrontation, that shouldn't have been a problem, but something said, keep going. To this day, he still cannot explain it, but he knows something said, do not interact with her that day, and he knew something was off. My wife similarly has told me about when she went grocery shopping with one of our sons when they were only 2 years old. Was it 2 years old that he was? 1 and 3. Okay. And she was walking around. There was this gentleman in his wonderful white van. Those have a bad reputation. Probably should. Anyway, so he was following her around the store at a distance, and she wasn't sure exactly what was going on, but she felt this instinct that was just telling her something was off, something was off, something was off. Then once she had went outside, the gentleman kind of engaged in conversation with her, and he started talking, and he seemed like really, really nervous. And she said something told her to just stick the key in, like she had put the kids inside the car, and something told her to put the key in the door and lock it. And even though she was trying to keep on this nice conversation, she listened to that instinct and locked the door. And she said as soon as she did that, she saw this man just deflate. and she like looked down for a second to take care of the groceries, and when she looked up, the guy was gone, and so was the van. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination what it is that probably would have happened there if she had not listened to her instincts and had not listened to those emotions. If she just allowed social norms and all this other stuff to control her behaviors, then she would have missed out on an opportunity to hear those divine instructions that oftentimes come through these strong emotions that God uses to move us one way or the other. All right, how's everybody doing? That's some heavy stuff. But emotions have a specific purpose. And if we learn how to listen to and attune to them, not be controlled by them, but how to use these emotions to our advantage, then we can not only improve the quality of our lives, but we can sometimes even save our lives or someone else's. So a couple of other strategies that I want to share with you is using your senses. So earlier today, we were talking about how Moses, when he was feeling anxious and paranoid about the future, not knowing whether or not he'd be able to speak to Pharaoh, God tells him to take off your shoes and put your feet on the flat ground. And as he does this, he begins to become more grounded. The second thing he also says is, when Moses is asking, well, how am I going to get them to believe me? Notice the second question that God asked Moses. He says, what is in your hand? I don't know if anybody thought that was a strange question, but he asked, what is in your hand? Here it is. He's projecting into the future. What's all these things going on? He said, what is in your hand? He brings his attention to the present moment. And a lot of times by using your senses, you can actually shift your mind away from some of these really difficult emotions. So there was a man who was dealing with his daughter who was taking his daughter to a soccer game, and she was really, really distraught. She was worried that her team was going to lose. She was really nervous about practice, didn't want to really play the game, and she was kind of crying and pouting in the background. And then a song came on the radio that they were both very familiar with. And what he did is he didn't know why, but he just started singing the song. And like singing the way that only a dad who's overly enthused about his past can do. And he started singing the song like really loud and really started belting it out. And then she started singing along with him. And before they knew it, they were kind of laughing almost to the point of tears. And then she got out and then went ahead and went to practice. Now what had happened here was now just something as simple as music was able to shift her emotions. So one of the other things that we can do to help us in managing our emotions is to make use of our senses. And one of those is sound. Now music is particularly a powerful instrument because if I read to you the words Amazing Grace, you might think, okay, those are neat words. But how many people have ever just sang a song, even though you already knew the words, but it was when you started singing the song that it really started to touch you, it really started to move something inside of you? How many people have had this experience before? This is the power of our senses coming into alignment with our thoughts and feelings. So sometimes when our emotions are too much, and sometimes we do have to be able to overcome like our fears and anxieties, something that can help us is using our senses to bring us in the present moment. So for Moses, that was the staff. Then he took that staff and he threw it on the ground, and anybody remember what it turned into? A snake, right? So he was afraid of Pharaoh, but now when the snake is on the ground, guess what he's afraid of? He's afraid of the snake. Now, here's the really cool part, and don't miss this. This is one of the coolest things that you can do for people in therapy, especially using their senses to help them reprogram their emotions. He throws the stick on the ground, it turns into a snake, and then God tells him to grab the snake. What part of the snake? The tail. Now, you want to do that because grabbing a snake by the head is a bad idea. If you don't know how fast snakes are, let me just give this to you. Our reaction time is somewhere around 0.2 of a second. Between 0.2 and half a second is roughly about human reaction time. I used to run track and field, and you can actually get a false start for starting too close to the sound of the gun. So if somebody has a reaction time within 0.1 seconds of the gun, they know it's a false start because sound doesn't travel fast enough to get to you, and your senses are too slow to actually register the sound that quickly. So guess how fast snakes move? A snake can dart, bite, and retract within 0.2 of a second. So literally, for you, by the time you saw the snake, it's already done doing what it did. Like their reaction times, their attack times are faster than our reaction times. If you just want one little mind-boggling thing, I just want you to consider this for a second. Because we're always living 0.2 of a second in the past, there's never been a time where you actually have seen anything happen in real time. Everything you're seeing and hearing right now happened 0.2 of a second ago. So just let that soak into your brain and just live with that. That's fun. This is part of the reason, incidentally, like when you're playing with small children, you throw them a ball. You notice what happens, like when they're really tiny, you throw them a ball, and the ball will just and they do it later. It's because they're actually living in what they see as real time. Now, as you've become an adult, you know how to predict where the ball is going. And that's why people can play little tricks on you where they go like this and they don't actually throw it and you do this whole thing. You do that because you're not living in real time. You're living 0.2 of a second behind. Your brain has learned to adapt to it. Can I tell you one more fun thing Let's make the Bible even more real. What is the first animal that humans had to be wary of? Snakes. And you know the only way to deal with a snake? You can't deal with a snake in real time. You have to be able to predict what it's going to do before it does it. The best way to deal with a snake is to keep your distance and not to get too close to it because it's going to be too fast. So you actually have to be prepared for snakes. You can't react to snakes once they show up. You have to be prepared for them. Did God prepare them for the snake? The answer is yes. What did he tell them? Of all the trees of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, yes. And he tells them what would happen. Not 0.2 of a second before it happened, but, well, actually we don't know how long. At least hours, if not days, before the actual event. Okay, y'all are not excited as I am. That's just cool stuff. God is really, really wise. So fear is there to teach you something. It's there to help us. But if you can use your senses, then you can actually help to shift yourself out of the emotion. And if you can get ahead of your emotions, then you can actually catch yourself long before the problem happens. And so when I work with people on trying to manage anger and other types of emotions, we talk about setting up an environment that allows you to have these reminders. In fact, one of the cool things that I've done with people and other therapists have done is like having people like put something on them that reminds them. Like this young girl, she put a rubber band around her wrist. She could remind herself to speak more kindly to herself and to not lose her temper. And so whenever she looked at that rubber band, it would remind her, oh yeah, I need to do this. And what's really cool about that is the more you do it, the more your brain actually starts to remember that before the event happens. So as soon as she would even get angry, she would see that rubber band and learn to calm down. Now, does the Bible have anything like a rubber band in it where people were supposed to look on it and supposed to remind them of something so that they didn't make... Anybody know any people who are Orthodox Jews? Do you know what they hang on their belt and on their side of their waist? They hang blue tassels. And you know what those blue tassels are there to remind them of? The Ten Commandments. First therapist in the Bible was not David Jones, it was Jesus. Anyway, other things that you can use with your senses are the power of smells. Smells can have a profound impact on your senses. Your olfactory bulb, which is a part of your brain that detects smell, is right next to your amygdala, which is your fight or flight, like your anger response, but also your other emotions. And smell and emotions are so close to one another that it actually impacts just about everything. Like one of the senses that you can most powerfully influence by, the emotion that you can be most influenced by is your sense of smell, because they're right next to each other. It's also tightly paired with memory because it's right next to your hippocampus as well, which is responsible for memory. And so smells can have a profound impact. Now, quick biblical illustration of this. There's somebody who was told that because of what they did would never be forgotten. It would always be remembered. Does anybody know who in the Gospels did the most memorable event that was literally quoted in all 4 Gospels that Jesus himself said would always be remembered? Yes. Yes, and you all remember it. And guess what's associated with that alabaster box? An overpowering smell. By the way, when Jesus was suffering, because this is one of the last things that was done before he was buried, guess what he could still smell even while he was on the cross? Because it even said she poured it on his head, and that sticks around for a while. Incredible stuff. So even Jesus, in his worst discouragement, had a smell to remind him that someone believed, that someone appreciated. And in fact, she becomes one of the largest symbols of what God is able to do through his forgiving and redeeming love. And when all his disciples forsake him and everyone denies him and people are spitting on him, he has a smell that reminds him that what he's doing is worth it. This making sense to everyone? Now, I hope you're taking mental notes. You can also take physical ones too, but I hope you're taking mental notes because every single one of these things can help you when you are facing these emotional crises. The last one that I'll cover as far as senses are concerned is a second set on sound. So we had a negative story about mice and how they all got afraid of cherry blossom, but that probably wasn't such a bad idea because they're all being raised by these scientists, and scientists sometimes aren't very nice. Like they shock rats, they cut their brains open and analyze them to find out like how they're ticking and working. So maybe they should have been afraid of cherry blossom because if their parents were afraid of it, they probably had a good reason. Well, there's a second thing they did with mice, and what they did is they separated the mothers from their pups, right? And so when pups are being raised, their mothers will like lick them and do all this other stuff, and it turns out that that grooming behavior that they do for their pups is actually helping with the development of their brain. And this happens with human children too. So when you nurture and foster your children, you hug them, you love them, you kiss them, you don't have to necessarily lick them the way that mother rats do. I don't recommend that. But anyway, like if you take good care of them, then they actually, their brains will develop differently because their brains are trying to prepare for what kind of world they're living in. When we leave the children to like just sit there and cry and cry and cry and cry incessantly, even though that's a lot of what else we're taught, it actually trains the child to believe that the world is a pretty threatening and hostile place, and their brain will wire itself to prepare for a threatening and hostile place. This isn't just make-believe either. Like the stress hormones that are being released in the brain, the adrenaline, the norepinephrine, all these pieces here start to shrink some of the structures, like your hippocampus and your prefrontal cortex. They won't develop as much because the brain is not developing for that. But the amygdala, like the part that's responsible for your fight, flight, and survival, will grow much larger. So when they see these children, they can tell if they grew up in a stressful environment because their brains and their nervous system is wired for a fight, but it's not really wired for love and connection. Wild stuff. Now, what's cool is all that's redeemable. This is part of the reason why, when Jesus says he wanted to gather the children of Israel like chicks under his wings, it's still redeemable. That warm hug still works. People's brains can rewire themselves, so this is not destiny, it's just a pathway. So, coming back to the mother pups, what they did is they separated the pups from their moms, and which is tough because the pup really wants its mom there, and then they started to scare the little pup by playing like loud, erratic noises and doing things that would normally scare little pups. But then, what they did is they actually allowed them to have a good relationship with their moms, but what they did is they piped in sounds of the mother rat, because the mother rat can hear the pup is in distress, and it starts instinctively making noises, like almost like trying to say, it's okay, you're gonna be all right, don't worry. And what they found is that when they played the sounds of the mother's reassurance, the pup, all their stress levels and hormones would begin to decrease precipitously. They would actually begin to be soothed by the sound of their mother's voice. Incredible stuff. Now you're like, what does that have to do with human beings? Well, has anybody ever been really comforted when you start singing songs from childhood? And it just kind of takes you back to something, at least if it was a positive moment within your childhood? All these things actually still work today. We can still be soothed by these sounds that can bring peace to us in this moment. Okay. All right. So, the part that I'm going to skip to now is I would love to tell you more about the brain model and all these other pieces, but what we're going to do is we're going to jump to our last strategy for how to deal with the brain. Now, we're going to have a time for Q&A at the end of this, and so if anybody would like to hear more about some of these other strategies that I'm unfortunately skipping past right now, then please let me know. Now, we ended our last message looking at self-talk, but what I want to do is I want to bring self-talk into the forefront because I think it's one of the most effective ways that you can really calm yourself down and give you some really specific strategies about how to do it. Now, what's really cool is that self-talk is not a new idea in psychology. It's something that actually comes from Scripture. You can find this in Psalm chapter 4 and then verses 1 and 4. And listen to what David says. He says, "Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. Thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress." That is, you gave me a larger foundation, a broad foundation upon which to stand. You were able to bring joy into my life when everything was falling apart. Now he says, "Stand in awe and sin not. Commune with" what? Do you see that in there? "With your own heart upon your bed and be still." So even very early on, we cry out to God, we pray, we do these things, but one of the other things it says here is to commune with your own heart. Now, one of the reasons this is so important is that we are talking to ourselves all the time. And you might say, well, how much do we talk to ourselves? Check this out. It says human beings talk to themselves increasingly, with some studies estimating that the average person has between 6,000 and 60,000 thoughts per day. That is a lot. That's like several thoughts every second that you're constantly having at any given time. So somewhere between 6,000 and 60,000 thoughts per day. Now, do you think if you listen to something that often throughout the day, do you think it's going to start to have an effect on you if those thoughts are negative? Like 100% it will have an impact on us if our thoughts are negative. So can this repetitive act be utilized to help to create a sense of security and regulate emotions? Could this be a simple alternative to trephination? So that was the drilling holes in the brain. I don't think nobody here wants to sign up for that particular strategy. Okay, so if we're going to do something different than trephination, then maybe we should have a strategy that we know can work. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you straight to the technique. And there was a really cool experiment that they did where they were looking at how self-talk really affects us. Okay, so there's something called the Solomon effect, all right? So the Solomon effect is a term that was coined because Solomon was one of the wisest men in the world. This is even among secular scientists. They understand that Solomon was a very wise figure in history. Now, Solomon had excellent advice. How many people enjoy reading Proverbs and like reading through Ecclesiastes? Like, I'm a big existential guy, so I love his stuff in Ecclesiastes, but he has this incredible advice. But he had a problem. He could give really good advice. But did he take his own advice? No, he did not. And this is what is called the Solomon paradox or the Solomon effect. Because Solomon was really good at telling other people how to straighten out their lives. Y'all have probably never come across this before, people who are really good at telling you how to fix your life. Okay. But people are excellent at telling you how to fix your life and telling other people how to fix their lives, but they're horrible at taking their own advice. Now, wouldn't it be cool if there was some way to listen to our own advice the way that we give it? Wouldn't that be awesome if there was some kind of strategy that allowed people to do this? Well, let me just read this really quickly to you. So a particular study asks, does silently talking to yourself in the third person constitute a relatively effortless form of self-control? We hypothesize that it does, under the premise that third-person self-talk leads people to think about their self in a similar way to how they think about others, which provides them with the psychological distance needed to facilitate self-control. So if you're not tracking with me, one of the things they found is that if people refer to themselves in the third person, then they are better at taking their advice than if they refer to themselves in the first person. Now, there's several ways that they studied this. First, they had people write about a negative event in the first person, like, this bad thing happened to me, I went to work, and Samantha was gossiping about me, and she was talking trash about me to one of my coworkers, and I felt really upset, and I didn't like how she said this, and I, me. And what they found is that when people talked about events in the first person, their emotions, their moods, and everything went down. Consistently went down. But then all they had them do was just a little trick. And they said, instead of talking about yourself in the first person, I, me, my, talk to yourself in the second or third person, you, David, he, she. And just by changing that, without changing anything else, by simply changing how they spoke to themselves in the third person, their moods began to elevate. They began to look at the situation differently. So now, instead of I went into work and Samantha was trash talking me, it's like, David went to work today. Samantha was talking a lot of trash. She was probably in a bad mood, but David didn't have to really deal with that. In fact, David got to work and decided that he was going to focus on what he needed to focus on. Just by shifting the person, people's advice got better, people's moods got better, and they changed exactly how they spoke to themselves. Now, since we are here in a mostly Christian audience here, I want to share something with you about why I think this is particularly significant. Now, anybody read through Mark chapter 5 where you have this man who was a demoniac who was, crying and cutting himself with stones? Okay, when these demons take over and they're talking through him, when they come to Jesus, they say, let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Now, when they are talking in the first, second, or third person? They are talking in the first person. When demons come along, they always spoke to people in the first person as though their thoughts were yours. Now, don't miss this. Demons never really let you know they're there. They don't. In fact, if you even look at how Satan spoke to Eve in the garden, he kind of starts out talking as though he's in the middle of a sentence. He's like, yeah, did God really say that? That's not how you start a sentence with anybody. Go try this later on today. We just go walk up to somebody and say, yeah, but that's probably not what he meant. You don't start a sentence in the middle. You usually try to provide context. But he doesn't. He just starts talking like he is just simply reading her mind. And you never see God talk like this. Every time God speaks to people, he comes in the third person. Incidentally, when we talk about the Trinity, who's the third person of the Godhead? The Holy Spirit. Okay. That's incredible. Who'd have thought? Apparently these researchers did. And so, when people speak to themselves in the third person, it improves their moods. It improves their moods. When you see God speaking to Elijah, he says, what doest thou here? He speaks to him in the second and third person. He calls him Elijah. He calls him by his name and speaks to him, makes it very clear that there are two different people here. You're still in control of yourself, but I am speaking to you. This little trick all by itself improved people's emotion regulation. Now, they took it a step further that I think is even cooler. Now, this is what's called distant self-talk, speaking to yourself in the third person. They took it a step further. This is one of my favorite experiments I've seen because they use little kids for it, and kids are so transparent, and you could really just learn a lot from children. So what they did is they had these kids all sign up for a study, and these kids are like 6, 7, 8 years old. So yeah, lots of self-control, right? At 6, 7, 8 years old. Attention span is at least 2 hours, because they don't get bored during sermons. Okay, so they had these 6, 7, and 8-year-olds, and what they did is they gave them a task. And they said, we really need you to do this task. So what's going to happen is we're going to give you a little iPad, and instead of a really fun, flashy game, we're going to have this game where, now pay attention, a piece of cheese is going to pop up. And if you see a piece of cheese, that means don't do anything. Okay? So that's your first instruction. Cheese means don't do anything. And then there's going to be a second picture where you see a mouse. And if you see a mouse, you hit the space bar. You ready to have some fun? Are you all ready to have some? Does this sound like fun to you? No, it does not. And it didn't sound like fun to 6, 7, 8-year-olds, but like, hey, just do it as long as you can. And if you get bored, then what we have is we have this little baby over here. And they pull out this nice iPad, and it's got these games where, you can make this frog jump on the lily pad, and the lily pads like blow up, or you can play like your favorite game like Dora the Explorer and all that stuff. And as soon as you're tired of playing the cheese and mouse game, which, by the way, they slowed it down by like 5 times slower than it's supposed to be, so not only is it boring, but it's boring and slow. As soon as you're done with that, you can start playing on the iPad over here and have some fun. So how long do you think these kids lasted choosing between the mouse game and the actual fun game where they can jump around and things blow up and all this fun stuff? Well, they added a little trick. They said, in scenario number 1, we just want you to talk to yourself through it. Like, I've got to do a good job. The researchers are really counting on me. And the second scenario, they had them do the distant self-talk, like I was telling you all about. David, you got to do a good job. David, the researchers are really counting on you. But then they added a third. And in this third one, they got to pick their favorite heroes. If they like Batman, if they like Dora the Explorer, or they liked whomever, they were going to speak to themselves as though they were Batman, or as though they were Dora, and as though they were their favorite cartoon character. And in that third one, it's like, Batman has a job to do. Batman must impress the researchers. He must stick in it as long as he possibly can. Now, between those 3, which one of those do you think did the best? It's the third group. Now, this is wild. Now, when they looked at it, the first group did okay. They probably lasted about 1 or 2 minutes, and then they just fell off and played the other one. The second group did better than them by at least twice as much. They were able to stay in it about 4 or 5 minutes. But it was the last group that was able to go almost a full 10 minutes, sticking in their role as Batman or as Dora. And so what they found that makes it even more effective is if you have a powerful example to whom you look up to if you're emulating that person. Y'all are not as excited as I am. Do we have an example of whom we are supposed to imitate? Paul actually uses the word, be imitators of me. When it says be followers of me, the word there is imitators. It comes from the word where we get mimic or mimesis. And so he actually says, be imitators of me as I imitate Christ. And if you have an example whom you are pointing to and imitating, it actually increases self-control by like 30-fold. That's incredible. And it was in the Bible long before the researchers did it. And so if you're going to talk to yourself, first try the third person, but if you really want to get like extra points, try speaking to yourself from the perspective of the person you look up to. And I want to recommend to you Jesus, because the way that Jesus speaks to us is not only a good reflection of how we ought to conduct our lives, but Jesus speaks to us as one who actually loves us, who knows us inside and out. Read Psalm 139. It talks about this. He says, he knows my down sittings, my uprising. There's not a thought that I have, but the Lord knows it afar off. That means before you start thinking about what you're going to be thinking about at 6:36 p.m. tomorrow, God already knew this from thousands of years ago. Like, that's how deeply God knows you. And if you can see yourself through his eyes, and you can think about yourself the way that he would think about you, and you can speak to yourself the way that he would be speaking to you, then your ability to regulate and control your emotions goes up. This is not just based on what Scripture says, which that is plenty of authority, but scientific studies will show you the exact same thing. We are soothed by the thought of thinking the thoughts after an example after us. All right, it is 3:01. and that means that I'm exactly 1 minute farther than I wanted to go. So I'm going to pause here, and what I'd like to do is to make sure that we can maybe open the floor for any questions that people do have, whether we're talking about emotion regulation or intergenerational trauma or the trauma bonding that we talked about in the first evening. Okay, we have a question back here. Now, do we want to use roving mics, or did we want to just try to speak? I don't know if there are any roving mics, are there?
You referred to
yes.
some of the solution with relationships and social dynamics.
Yes.
But if you're not a people person, a guy I know, I mean, he has a lot of acquaintances, he has very few friends, then how's that going to apply to him with his psychological problems?
Yes. Okay. So the question for anybody that didn't catch it, or if they're recording today, is how does somebody use the social relationship as a channel for improving like their traumas or healing from their pains and their. Oh, okay.
You'll have to turn your mic on.
Oh, I have to turn it off. Okay. Okay, so okay, all right, good, all right. So so how do you deal with someone like this? So the first thing is that I have to talk to a lot of people.
Can you comment on the interplay between social anxiety, depression?
So depression is typically going to be an experience that someone has where they're going to have sad or low moods. Another one that's not talked about a lot is the anhedonia, which is the inability to experience pleasure, so they actually don't enjoy things very much anymore in general. And lots of negative rumination and social isolation and disturbances of sleep, low energy, and a host of other things. So anxiety and depression in general have a bouncing back and forth relationship. Somebody's depressed, as the depression goes down, their anxiety goes up. And the opposite usually what happens too is the anxiety goes down, the depression goes up. The reason for this is like if somebody's depressed, if they try to break out of that, they usually try to get out more. But as soon as they start thinking about going out more, the social anxiety starts to creep up. It's like, well, if I go out there, people are going to judge me, I'm going to have negative views of me. So then their anxiety starts to go up. But then they make the decision like, you know what, I'm just going to be done with people. I'm just going to cut everyone off. And like that decreases the anxiety, but now that they're not around people, guess how they start to feel? Start to feel depressed. And so the relationship they have with each other is that one goes up, the other goes down, and one goes down, the other goes up. And they actually have a bouncing back and forth relationship. So it's part of a vicious cycle. But what they also have in common is some of the solution. That a lot of times what's really necessary is for that person to actually be able to connect with someone start addressing the core reasons behind their anxiety and depression. And when people in particular struggle with negative self-appraisal, like they view themselves negatively, a lot of the work that needs to be done is actually dealing with how their self-esteem issues came up in the first place. Because some of that stuff started from how they were treated, how people have negatively criticized them, and a lot of times it has less to do with what people are saying today and more to do with what people said yesterday. So a lot of what needs to happen there is the person needs to start to root out some of those old narratives, those old beliefs, and start to shift those beliefs towards things that are more positive and adaptive, that allow them to be more resilient and see themselves in a better light. Does that kind of answer that part of it?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, here. Now, before we take this one, any questions? I'm by to answer anybody's questions that you have, but I want to make sure that if there are any other ones that we're going to do that. But yes.
Can you comment on the effectiveness of the herb St. John's wort in treating depression?
Yes, so St. John's wort can act in a very similar way that SSRIs do. They can actually increase the amount of serotonin that's in your bloodstream. In fact, most psychiatrists or nurse practitioners that are prescribing medications will want to know if they're taking St. John's wort because then you can have like serotonin syndrome, which is a really massive problem where like your body has too much serotonin and it actually starts to cause negative side effects. St. John's wort seems to help to boost the amount of production of serotonin.
Am I allowed one last question?
Sure.
Can you comment on the effectiveness in some people of CBD to treat anxiety of any type?
Yeah, so if I can kind of CBD, think of it kind of, this is basically cannabis oil. So I'm always a little bit leery about any things that are coming from substances. However, I do know that many of the clients that I speak to, they either use CBD oil or they actually just smoke marijuana. And part of the reason for that is because of several things. One is that it helps with appetite suppression. You actually have in your brain what we refer to as cannabinoid receptors, which comes from the term cannabis. And just as a little side note, drugs only work if your brain already does it, right? So the reason that cannabis works is because you have a receptor for cannabis, but that's because your brain naturally produces what cannabis also produces. And so what people are doing when they're taking drugs is they're trying to boost artificially what their brain isn't producing enough of. And so part of the reason that things like this actually work is because the drug is acting the part that your brain is not doing. Now, the downside to a lot of this stuff is that cannabis, a lot of research that they've done on cannabis, it's like a 15-year-long study demonstrated that any prolonged use of cannabis, whether intermittent or regular routine use, actually decreases IQ points. You actually lose a whole standard deviation of IQ from sustained marijuana use. So it's not innocent. The third observation on this is that now that they've gotten to the place where you can put cannabis oil into like e-cigarettes, they're actually getting to places where you can actually overdose on cannabis. We never thought of it. Now you have the potency of this oil is something like, it's like smoking 1,000 joints, which most people can't do in a single moment per day, which is why there's never been any concern about overdose of cannabis. But now that we've concentrated the oils in such high amounts, it's actually becoming dangerous. And of course, there's less with fentanyl and all those pieces. But yeah, CBD oils do tend to have like a calming effect. It helps to return appetite, it helps to return a sense of motivation. This is why people oftentimes will do it, because they're constantly high-strung and super anxious, more people really depressed and having no appetite. And so it does boost that, but it boosts it at a cost, and that's why, I don't know if CBD oil has any negative side effects as THC does, because it has THC removed from it, but it still seems like a little bit of a risky bet. But as far as I know, I can comment. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't speak much on what it does to the brain, but much that I can do some of these apply a little bit later taking on something that could have some negative side effects to it. You just don't know exactly what they are. All right. Other questions on any of the topics?
I just wondered if you would touch on how much a person's diet or exercise and rest and all that has to do with all of this.
Yes. All right. So let me say this in a single sentence and I'll elaborate. Of all the treatments, whether therapy, medication, or any other thing that you can do, there's one treatment that beats out every other treatment. That treatment is exercise. Exercise is the most potent remedy from every health condition, mental or physical, that we can possibly imagine. And the reason for this is that your body is designed to move. Your body is 100% designed to move. Even like most of the things in your brain that help you to think and reason, all of it starts with the motor portions of the brain, your whole cortex, cortex. So cortex, just so you all know with some of these terms, your cortex is the outer part of your brain. The word cortex actually just means bark, like tree bark. So that's a couple way to remember what cortex means. We're talking about the outside provide the appropriate building blocks for your brain. It helps to clear toxins out of your brain. There's so many studies that it would be impossible for me to say everything all in a single just a few sentences. But the one thing I'll tell you about exercise and nutrition, but exercise in particular, is that exercise increases something in your brain that's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, so BDNF. And BDNF is what is referred to as like a fertilizer for your neurons. Now your neurons are constantly growing and making new connections, and things wire up in your brain so that you can actually remember more information, so you can think more efficiently. And BDNF is like a fertilizer that helps that to grow. Now BDNF is usually something that's enhanced by things like serotonin, which is why SSRIs are thought to be really helpful because it helps to increase the size of the hippocampus, that's responsible for memory. But exercise alone will actually increase the BDNF production in your brain, so you can learn new ways to deal with your problems. And this is why you can even indirectly get better at coping with stress by just exercising and eating better, because your brain will actually start providing all the fertilizers necessary to grow the right kind of brain. And my plants this time we're talking about neurons and all this fun stuff in your brain. So exercise and nutrition can be extremely important because it helps to build the very brain you need to get you out of the problems you're in. All right. Other questions? Okay, Bill, please just don't knock this. Oh, wait, you're going to get your mic back.
Oh. Would not having a good sense of smell affect any of your emotions?
That's a good question. So, yes and no. So this is the interesting trade-off. Your brain, while it's designed to allow you to use your five senses, back at five, for our purposes, to use your five senses, if one of them starts to go, other ones will start to enhance. Right? Now, smell is tricky because smell and taste are deeply connected. You can try this out. Plug your nose when you eat a strawberry. It's very hard to describe how a strawberry tastes different than anything else. I mean, you can tell that it's a little bit different, but the flavor of a strawberry does not come from its taste, it comes from its smell. And so if you plug your nose and eat like something that's strawberry flavored, you won't really be able to tell it's strawberry if you can't smell it. So anyway, so it has some important implications, right? Like there's something that can get hard. But when your brain can't be used to deal with that sense, those same neurons, in this case your olfactory bulb, will get used for something else. And so one of the ways we see this really happen is like with people who are blind. So they still have an occipital lobe just like you do. Your occipital lobe takes up almost 30% of your cortex in the back of your head and is responsible for processing visual information. But for somebody who's deaf, or somebody who's blind, they use it too. It's just they use it for touch, and they use it for sound. In fact, there was a woman who was able to read Braille and was very proficient at it. When there was like an explosion or something and it damaged her occipital lobe. And when it damaged her occipital lobe, even though she was blind, she couldn't read Braille because, quote, she could not see the letters anymore. Right? So these same parts of your brain that are responsible for doing things like sight, sense, smell, if they're not being used for the appropriate sense, they'll get adopted into some other part. So somebody who loses that will probably have a really enhanced sense of something else. And so your brain will find a way to work around it. It'll still use that bulb, but it'll probably do something different. I hope that's cool information for you. Okay.
One of the first temptations of Christ was about food. Why is it that food has such a powerful influence on us?
Yeah, so I'll give you the short answer. It's because it's necessary for survival.
How about the long answer?
Okay, so the long answer is that because food is essential for survival, it incorporates everything. Whenever you eat food, you don't just have a taste and gustatory response. You don't just have like an olfactory smell. You also have a sense of touch and texture. In fact, here's a really cool scientific experiment. So like when they had people eating, I believe they were eating like chocolate or eating some kind of dessert. And what they did is in one scenario, they just let them eat the chocolate. And in the second one, they let them eat the chocolate, but they played the sounds of somebody crunching on something. And it was in the second one where they heard the sound of crunching that they had a stronger emotional attachment and more enjoyment of the actual food just by hearing the sound of crunching when they were eating. So if when you are eating, you are having a full-on sensory experience that's both emotional and is also physiological. You know, they did semi-starvation studies. I think this was back in like the 1960s or 70s before like the International Board for Ethical Treatment of Human Beings was like really in full effect. Anyway, so they starved these guys and they gave them like 500 calories a day, which you could survive off of, but not very happily. And they noticed a number of things that began to happen to these people as they began to starve. It was all men at that time because apparently you study a man and it tells you everything. anyway, sorry. So that's not accurate. But anyway, so it's all men in the study. And what started to happen in the course of the experiment is that the men began to obsess over food. They would journal about it. They would talk about it. Check this out. As they became more and more starved, every other desire faded. They had no desire, like, even though they were happily married men and all this stuff, they had no desire for sexual relations. They didn't care about what happened on their job. All they cared about was food, which is wild. And what it tells us is this particular function in the body is so powerful that it's capable of overbearing every other sense in the body. It's still one of the worst ways for people to die is to starve to death because nothing else in the world will matter other than food. And it doesn't quite work that way with other senses. In fact, if you go too long without drinking, you'll be thirsty for like the first few days. But as you get closer and closer to that 1 or 2 week mark, you actually will lose your sense of thirst. You'll get really warm, and then you'll actually start to feel kind of euphoric and peaceful. This is oftentimes when people who are elderly will sometimes die. A lot of times they die of dehydration. But when they die, by the time they get towards the end, it doesn't occur anymore. So thirst doesn't work that way. Only hunger has the power to overbear every other sense. One last little comment on this, one long answer, is that for the people who are able to overcome their appetites, they actually experience benefit from their long period of fasting. They actually got closer to God, closer to the people in their lives. They were able to overcome it. They had to have something that was bigger than the appetite in order to do that. Every single person that had that thing was way happier and actually functioned with it at the end of the experiment. As opposed to one of the other guys that cut off his fingers and started to have psychotic delusions. It was really wild. Hopefully they never do that again, but hunger is a powerful drive within the food system. It can overbear every other desire. That's why appetite is the big focus in the scripture. So no coincidence.
Yeah, what would you say or recommend to somebody? Because I'm specifically asking for my brother and my stepmom. Because my dad died last November and they live 2 hours away, and both of them are having an extremely hard time dealing. My brother's doing a little better than my stepmom, but she's pretty much secluded. She gets up and goes to the bathroom, and the rest of the time she's in the bed. But neither one of them are handling the situation as well off as I am because they don't have the support group that I have through my church and my family here. So is there anything I could give them, tell them to do, watch, or read, or that could help get them further along than what they are? Because I feel like with some of the stuff my brother posts on Facebook, like he's very close to giving up, and when I see those posts, I call him or communicate best I can, but I was just wondering if there's anything that you could tell me to help with that.
No, first of all, I want to appreciate you grabbing that question. These are very hard spaces to be in. It sounds like they're really involving some pretty significant depression. I mean, certainly, like as far as reading materials, I really recommend a lot of actually Dr. Headley's work. He looks at he has like depression on the way out. Like he's actually has some really, really practical tips for how to get started. Of course, I'm really biased towards therapy. That's what I do for a living, and I talk to people who are in these kind of spaces. But the big pieces, the most approachable parts are one, stay in contact with them. Even if they don't answer the phone, even if they don't seem to be like attending to you, people, even when they're really depressed, they remember who spoke to them who did not. Even though they don't say it and they act like they don't care, it's not true. They actually recognize people are reaching out to them. So one is just stay in routine contact. Now you don't have to try to like come to a counselor and try to talk them through it because that's actually extremely difficult. But just be somebody who reaches out and cares. The second thing is, if it's possible, help them to start getting active in something. Even something as passive as like gardening or just taking a short walk every day can be extremely helpful because what will happen is if they keep staying inside all the time, they're left with nothing but their thoughts keep moving and circling around them. And so this is one area where I would say that distraction is actually extraordinarily helpful, giving them something that can actually pull their attention away from it. The third thing is like if we deal with some of these external pieces, the internal parts of it really have to do with how to actually process the grief. And this is a little more challenging to try to do this. This is why I recommend putting them in contact with people who are professionals and know how to do this part. But a lot of it has to do with helping them to move towards acceptance. Acceptance is probably the hardest part of recovering from grief. Kubler-Ross had their 5-step formula for how you go through the 5 stages of grief. So the 5 stages for anybody who wants to know is DABDA, D-A-B-E-A. So the D is denial, because there's initially a lot of denial around this. Can't believe this happened. It's state shock. The next part here that comes negotiate with themselves, if I could just change this or change that, then everything would be fine. And then there's the fourth D, which is depression, which again sounds like this is where things get stuck. But the person who's just like, everything is over because now the person's gone, now life comes to a grinding halt. And usually what's needed between that step and the next one is the last one, which is acceptance. And so really helping to make peace with what has been lost in this process. So it's really, really hard to just like stand up here and give like a really super concise answer to what you do, but I would say the biggest plus if you can is continue to check in with them. Ask direct questions about suicide. I don't play around with that question, and I don't beat around the bush. I ask very directly, somebody is thinking of killing themselves, because people who are not going to be offended by that question. And sometimes people worry that by saying it, you're giving them the idea. But I can ask all of you right here, right now, are you thinking of killing yourself? You're not going to be like, no, but now that you say it, it doesn't work that way. People, if they're actually suicidal, it's because the thought is already there. And so be okay asking the direct questions around these pieces, but as much as possible, if they can start to get connected with the support, if they're just willing to take walks with you, or if they're just willing to get out of the house for a brief amount of time to do something that feels purposeful, that's the ground floor where I want to start first, because they have to start to break away from that a little bit before they can start working on it. But it sounds like they're really into it, and it's a very hard place to just jump out of all at once. So is that this helpful place to start?
Yeah, that's good, because like I said, I did actually put up. My brother, he drinks and does marijuana also, and like I said, his mom, my stepmom, she's gotten to the point when I talked to my brother yesterday, actually, she doesn't get out of bed at all except to go to the bathroom. She refuses to do anything that has to be done, and it's gotten really bad. And the reason that I'm wanting to try to help is because neither one of them are willing to go to professional, but my brother at least is still willing to communicate with me, because I'm afraid not just that he's suicidal, but that his mom might get to the point where, because 2 years ago she tried to shoot my brother, so just out of anger. So I'm trying to deal with all that through my brother, because she's not willing to talk to me, but my brother is, and I'm communicating as often and as much as I can. So
Does she communicate with your brother though? Like, do they still have communication between the two of them?
very little. Like he bought her something for Mother's Day and gave it to her, and she just looked at it and then threw it on the ground and then went got in bed. So
Yeah, so let's do this. If you have time afterwards, I can come and like maybe give some more specific, because there might be some really specific things that might be helpful in a situation like this. But the biggest piece is keep the line of communication open. And if it's possible, a more hands-on approach can be helpful of just being with the person. You don't, like I said, you don't have to jump into counseling with them. Just walking and talking with them about anything other than just the central issue can start to help them build a life outside of the grief, which is very necessary before the person can work on it, because they're so immersed in it right now, what you're saying, that it just sounds like it's completely dominating their experience. And so I think for yourself, just to not put too much pressure on yourself, is just to kind of do those things and ask the questions when necessary, but don't be afraid to ask them. These are the right questions to ask. And again, if it does come down to that point, you can call on behalf of somebody else if somebody actually is in danger of suicide. The number that anybody here can memorize, it's actually a national number now. It's just like 911, but it's 988. It's a mental health line. If you call that, it puts you in contact with emergency mental health services, which is super helpful because, if you call the police on somebody, the police come knocking on the door, you can imagine that doesn't really help somebody who's in a mental health crisis to see the police there. And so they have 988, which is actually a mental health emergency line that actually can get help right away to a situation like this. So when you have to call or they have to call, that's another number to make sure you have on top. But just make sure you're not putting too much pressure on yourself to try to save this one, because that's a very difficult spot to do. Even for professionals, it's a difficult space to be. So, yeah. Other questions?
I just have a question. What happens if you actually lose the use of one of your emotions, like crying? What happens to the brain then? Me personally, I haven't cried since 1997.
Yes. First of all, thanks for being willing to share that. So I work with this a lot, and a lot of times if an emotion is blocked like that, what I try to do is I try to figure out what the barriers are. I can tell you just, so I can't speak to your situation specifically, but I can tell you that when I work with people who have told me these kind of things, there's two things that I'll ask them. These inner questions you can ask yourself. What was the last thing that you actually cried about? I don't expect you to answer that right now. So what secondly, whenever something that should be sad and should bring up those emotions, what do you?
My question is, if anybody else has personal questions, I don't want to take away from that, but I've just really enjoyed everything you've said today, and we've learned a lot, but you skipped. You had to kind of fast forward at church time and, even this afternoon. So is there something that you skipped that you can summarize or that you can still share with us now?
Okay, so I'll do two things. One is our next.
Can you comment on the effectiveness of at least 10 minutes a day of sunshine as a mood elevator?